Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for the nice introduction. It's good to see some of you again. Hello, and to all you others, I'm really sorry that I cannot join you in Australia tonight, but things are what they are and not what we would like them to be. So I'm going to talk and I'm going to share this with you now. Give me a moment here about frozen villains, frozen fiends, as I would like to call them, cold theme villains in mainstream comics. And that's why I have many pictures. And I will try to show you lots of pictures and not talk too much. So as I wrote in the introduction, in the abstract, obviously the key story element in mainstream comics is this antagonistic dynamic between superheroes and supervillains. This keeps the story going and eventually towards the victory of good. And many of these villains that the heroes are faced with have certain patterns of powers or themes that they are based on. And by that, they often are turned into a mirror image of the hero, a dark mirror image, of course. And this dichotomy, you can see this, for example, between Batman, who comes across as very dark and brooding, and supposedly bright Joker. And if you got any questions about the Joker, please ask Anna-Sophie. I would say she knows more than I do about that. And but this mirror image idea, there's also this idea that the villains are based on certain power categories. So if you have a super strong hero like Superman or Thor or maybe the Hulk, then the adversary needs super strength too. But what I'm going to talk about are a group of villains that are bound together by something entirely different, because they are to various degrees representatives of a truly elemental force, the cold. And so this will be quite a journey, I would say, from frost giants of Norse mythology and their king Ymir, who are mainstays in the mighty Thor comic book, to modern high-tech villains like the Flash-archenemy, the eponymous Captain Cold. This is the gentleman you see here on the picture. And those cold-themed villains all play a major role in this constant struggle of good versus bad. And they all represent and or command a force that in its extreme is the opposite of life itself, the cold. So the first comic book cold-themed villain is from 1947, the so-called Icicle, and you see here on the cover, the coldest criminal in history. And he was the foe of Alan Scott. You see him here in the front, the first Green Lantern. And this is a classical duel of magic against science, because the source of the power of Green Lantern was a magic lantern, obviously, and which powered his magic ring. But the Icicle was a scientist who developed his own super weapon, the cold gun, and other cold emitting devices. And he had a gang of thugs who all looked rather strange, like creatures from a fairy tale, actually, but all of them were just robbers and thieves. And since this is the first period of comic books, the golden age, those villains, the heroes to some point too, are rather one-dimensional. So the Icicle, our first cold villain. There is a second Icicle. Here some covers from the 1980s, 90s, and from 2000. And the second incarnation of the Icicle is the son of the first one. And his powers are also gotten from technology, but there's a twist there. Since his father built this cold weaponry, his DNA was altered, and so the son can now project the cold from his body. And he's also just a supervillain, a bad guy. He keeps up popping every now and then, but it's not a major villain in the DC universe, which is, by the way, a fate shared by many heroes and villains from what I told you before, the first age, the so-called golden age of comic books. And in the case of DC, all of them got more or less redesigned in the Silver Age, so the second stage of comic books, which starts in the mid-50s. So, and this is the direct connection to the next villain, because Captain Cold is the redesigned Icicle. As there is a new Flash in the DC universe after the Golden Age, there's also a new Cold villain, and he's called Captain Cold. And Captain Cold, who together with other members of the so-called Gallery of Rogues, and he's also a major character of the so-called Arrowverse, you know that probably, the TV series based on DC Comics characters like Green Arrow, The Flash, Supergirl, and the Legends of Tomorrow. His name is Leonard Snart, and he starts out as a villain in the TV series, but becomes a hero who sacrifices his life, but he has since reappeared in different incarnations. But before that, Captain Cold, as I said here, this is from 1957, and he's, I would argue, the greatest Cold theme villain in comic books at all, maybe also due to the alliteration. Alliterations were very much on vogue in the Silver Age of comic books. One only has to think of Peter Parker, to name just one. He's also science-based, and here imagination is a bit stretched, because Leonard Snart was just a thug, and but then he was sent to prison by the Flash, and he studied and created a cold gun, and he thought he could transfer the power of a cyclotron into his cold gun, and then by scientific accident, the cold gun was created. He didn't even want to create the cold gun, but this is a typical thing in the 1960s in the Silver Age, to pseudo-scientific accidents leading to superpowers. Once again, Spider-Man is the prime example. And Snart himself, as I said, is not a scientist himself, but a blue-collar criminal, and he comes from a broken family. In a later stage, there's an added background story that he had an abusive father, and the only time he felt comfortable was with his grandfather, who drove an ice cream truck. So that's why he got this idea that cold is something good. As I said, it's a bit of a stretch that somebody like him can create the cold gun, but the Flash also is a bit of a stretch of imagination, because he was hit by lightning and then doused in chemicals and can now run at super speed. And once again, we think of Spider-Man, all of these accidents that create heroes and villains. And in a way, Cold is the opposite of the Flash, as his gun produces absolute cold, where all movement stops. And here we have once again this pattern that the hero is the opposite of the villain. And all of these Flash villains, the so-called Gallery of Rogues, they are all science-based, so pseudo-science-based, you might say. And most of them stole the technology they have, and to quote, they have now weapons that would make Einstein weep. So one of them, this is this guy here with the green mask. This is the weather wizard. He has a wand that allows him to control the weather, and he of course uses ice too when he creates blizzards, hailstorms, and things like that. And just on a side note, it is also very typical for the Silver Age are alliterations. So there's Captain Cold, there is Mirror Master, there is Weather Wizard, and there's the Pied Piper. So, and once again, coming back to the Arrowverse, I said a few words before that, and here is the Leonard Snart of the Arrowverse. He is portrayed by actor Wentworth Miller, and in the Arrowverse, they try to make him a bit more of a complex character. As I said, he sacrifices his life, but comes back later in other incarnations. And the Icicle, the gentleman on the right, is also part of this universe, but only a minor part. He is the scientist Thomas Snow, who can also project extreme cold from his body. But in the end, in another twist where the villain becomes a good guy at the end, he sacrifices himself to save the life of his daughter, Caitlin, who you might know is Killer Frost, who is our next villain. So Killer Frost, there are actually quite a few Killer Frosts in the DC universe, 3 to be exact. And the first one died in a fight with Firestorm. This is the character here. Once again, you see the dichotomy. There's fire and there is ice. And the second Killer Frost is the lady who has him frozen here. There's now a third one. The DC universe tends to reboot itself every now and then, and these minor characters then get rebooted too. And the current Killer Frost in the DC universe is also called Caitlin Snow, and she first appeared in 2013 as a result of the New 55 reboot. And all 3 are also pseudoscientists and even have, well, basic scientific principles behind them, because they absorb heat and turn it into cold. And the comic book Caitlin Snow is even somewhat of a vampire for heat, as she constantly craves it. And the TV Caitlin Snow, Killer Frost, she's the daughter of the Icicle that I just showed you. She's portrayed by Danielle Panabaker, and she's a scientist once again, and she's suffering from split personality disorder, working with Team Flash as Caitlin Snow, and fighting with, and sometimes even against, the Team Flash as Killer Frost. Interesting character. She's always there, but not so much in comic books. You all might know this gentleman now. Of course, Batman with his enormous gallery of villains. There has to be a cold-themed villain, so it's not only the Joker, the Penguin, Two-Face, we have a cold villain too. And while he's not first-grade villain, he still has quite a history. He appeared for the first time in 1952, still called Mr. Zero. And if you see this picture, it looked really quite weird, but this was due to a general silliness of the DC Comics universe during the Silver Age. In 1966, he was renamed as Mr. Freeze and would frequently clash with Batman. And once again, we have an accident involving science as the origin of this frozen fiend. Mr. Freeze, trying to find a cure for his terminally ill wife, Nora. A renowned cryogenics expert, was caught in a lab explosion. I mean, the pattern is quite obviously. And his body chemistry was altered that he has to wear such a cold suit all the time, otherwise he would not survive. And finding a cure for his wife used to be the main motivation for his crimes, but as you see on the right, he recently succeeded in curing her, but not the way he wanted, because she was turned into a female version of himself and into the criminal Mrs. Freeze. He himself is now in a coma, so we'll have to see. This was in 2019, and this is, to my knowledge, the last appearance of Mr. Freeze so far. Mr. Freeze, of course, has quite something to show on a media basis, in television and in movies. Actually, his name change to Mr. Freeze happened in the Batman television series in the 1960s, in the episode Instant Freeze. And if you know this television series, you know what I mean when I talk about Silver Age silliness, because this is absolutely unbelievable, wonderful, silly. The Joker, for example, the actor refused to shave off his mustache, so he painted white makeup over his mustache. And he would appear a couple of times, even played by interesting actors. Once he was played by Eli Wallach. And the second and the middle one, of course, you know that one. This is from the big screen movie Batman and Robin. That, by the way, was more or less unwatchable, not Arnold Schwarzenegger's fault. And I would say, and he also appeared in the Gotham television series and, of course, various animated TV episodes. And his story, origin story, staying more or less the same, which adds a bit of an element of tragedy to his villainy. So this is DC Comics. Let me now go to Marvel Comics. Of course, Marvel Comics has cold theme villains too, but as we will see, most of them are creatures of myth and magic, in contrast to DC science villains. Although this creatures of myth and magic comes with a little quotation here. There is, however, to my knowledge, one purely science-based villain in the Marvel Comics universe who, ironically, at first was named after the mythical Jack Frost, the personification of ice and snow. A scientist, once again, who tried to achieve immortality by means of cryogenics. And that's why he developed this cold projecting suit and tried to steal from Tony Stark, who we all know is Iron Man. And Iron Man, as the quintessential science hero of the Marvel Universe, fights, of course, mostly science-based villains. So Jack Frost was just a minor one. And Jack Frost would later change his name to Blizzard and was killed off in a Spider-Man adventure in 1986. And Marvel does occasional reboots too, not as strong as DC, but there's a new Blizzard now, but another minor villain, because he's just that, he's a criminal with a gimmick. The main Marvel villains are those. This is Ymir, the king of the ice giants. And one source of the inspirations for Marvel founding fathers Stan Lee and Jack Kirby was Norse mythology. The Marvel equivalent of DC's main hero Superman, the mighty Thor, not only fought conventional supervillains, but many of his main adversaries were mythological creatures. So Hail, the goddess of death, the fire demon Surtur, and the frost giants led by Ymir. And for this feature here, this was called Tales of Asgard, a backup story in the early issues of A Journey into Mystery, which then became the Mighty Thor. Lee and Kirby adapted tales from Norse mythology. Lee wrote this in and afterward. They had a paperback of Norse mythology, and when they read through the paperback and had adapted all the stories, they stopped with the Tales of Asgard feature, which is too bad because it was quite interesting. And according to the Edda sagas, Ymir was the primeval being from whose corpse the gods created the earth. In the Marvel Comics universe, Ymir is an immensely powerful elemental creature who tries to destroy all life by bringing about eternal winter. Together with opposite the fire demon Surtur, this is the right here, he tried to destroy the earth in this particular issues of Avengers, but of course got defeated. Ymir is a gigantic source of destruction, but story-wise offers little. So for all his power, he's not often seen in Marvel Comics and remains, for that, a minor villain. More interesting, probably this, and there's another frozen minion in the Marvel universe. These are the Frost Giants, and you might probably know them from the first Thor movie from 2011. Laufey, the king of the giants of Jotunheim, appeared for the first time in the Tales of Asgard stories I mentioned before in 1965. He was then slain by Odin, but was revealed as the father of Loki, everybody's favorite god of mischief, which we also see in this movie and many others. And due to the Thor movie, he made his comic book comeback more than 50 years later. and styled after the movie villain. And of course, he's trying to destroy humankind. Another engine of destruction, Loki, due to his being Loki's father, is that way more interesting a character than Ymir, but still with somewhat limited story potential. And in the so-called War of the Realms storyline, when the dark elves of Svartalfheim, the frost giants, and other villainous entities tried to conquer the 9 realms, Loki swallows his son Loki, who of course manages to survive. He's about 30 meters tall, by the way. It is also interesting to see in the case of Loki the reverse influence from movie to comic instead of the usual adaptation of comics into movies. And Loki is, by the way, the current king of the frost giant. And here is another cold-themed weapon this time, the ultimate cold weapon, the so-called casket of ancient winter. And you might also know it from the Thor movie, but it originated in a Thor comic in 1984 during the legendary run by creator Walt Simonson, who also draws from Norse mythology, as the casket supposedly contains the mythical Fimbulwinter, which is the last stage before Ragnarök, the ultimate destruction of the universe. So it appeared for the first time in Thor 345 in the hands of the dark elf Malekith. You might also know him from the second Thor movie. He destroyed the casket to release the Fimbulwinter, and this leads to a multi-issue crossover and finally to the restoration of the casket. In the Thor movie, the casket is the source of the frost giants' power, which Odin took away from them before the actual movie starts. Our armies drove the frost giants, this is a quote, back into the heart of their own world. The cost was great. In the end, their king fell and the source of their power was taken from them. And this is the casket you see here on the right. So a few things about this way mythology is used. And while the core of the Thor cosmos in the Marvel comics and the universe was constructed by Lee and Kirby, as I said, from this paper book of Norse mythology, it has an element of science in it. And this is especially good to see in the movies, but also in comic books. So here we have the so-called Destroyer. You also know him from the first movie, but he's more like a robot and not really a mythical creature anymore. And we also have the Bifrost, the Rainbow Bridge, which in the comic book is still a mythical thing, but in the Thor movies, sorry, this is clearly a science invention of science. The science is simply so advanced that it seems to be magical, when in fact it's just on a much higher level. And even in the Thor movie, there's a moment where Thor himself says this: your ancestors called it magic, but you call it science. I come from a land where they are one and the same. And both the Thor Dark World movie and the Ragnarök movie sometimes really feel like science fiction movies, because we have spaceships all over the place. But nevertheless, it's Asgardian from Norse mythology who write them. So there is a quite recent event here. It's called the Endless Winter, when DC tries to do something like this, and but this doesn't really work out. Marvel has Norse mythology, DC has Greek mythology with Wonder Woman and people like that. But in this recent crossover event, we have an icy villain called King Frost, who of course is trying to destroy the world. And King Frost is a meta-human from the 10th century in Greenland. Of course, he's defeated. And but this is, in a way, this is kind of getting nowhere there. This is a one-time event trying to sell lots of comic books, because the Frost Giants are entrenched in the Thor universe, in the Marvel universe, but not here, which is another interesting example to show the antagonistic relationship of the two universes. And am I okay with time? I got one more slide. Okay, because I found one more very interesting cold themed villain. Actually, it's a continuation of Ymir and the Frost Giants. So because we have this here now in Conan the Barbarian, and this is serious magic now. These are 3 adaptations of the original story from Robert E. Howard from 1932 called The Frost Giant's Daughter. And it was adapted in 1972, in 2004, and in 2020. The first one is by Roy Thomas and Barry Windsor Smith. Then Kurt Busiek, Kerry Nord, and we have a new one by French artists. And here the Conan, you all know him, Arnold Schwarzenegger played him, the genre-defying hero of the sword and sorcery genre, travels to the north where he encounters Atali, the eponymous daughter of the Frost Giant, and giving the cold the alluring image of a femme fatale. Atali tries to lure him into a trap where her 2 brothers are waiting to slay Conan. You see them in the middle here quite nicely. And of course, Conan kills the 2, but before he can take his revenge on Atali, she calls for her father Ymir and vanishes in a bolt of lightning that leaves the hero unconscious. And when Conan awakes, he thinks that this all was a dream, but he is still clutching the veil of Atali. And an absolutely classical short stories, and it has not only been adapted to comics, it would have been also the opening sequence to the never realized 3rd Conan movie with Schwarzenegger, Crown of Iron, which would also have been directed by John Milius. And coincidentally, because this is really a very, very important story, it was referred to in this month's, I just read this 2 days ago, Conan the Barbarian number 25, which is the 300th issue as a Marvel comic. So the cold as a feature of a harsh natural environment is often depicted in the adventures of Conan, and it gives him another obstacle to conquer. And in a poem, Howard describes Conan's place of origin as Chimeria, land of darkness and the night. So, and I come to the end. There are, of course, other minor cold theme villains, but I hope I could show you the major ones from both mainstream universes. And as I showed you, DC's Frozen Fiends are more or less exclusively science-based, while Marvel's prominent ice bad guys are from a realm of magic and fantasy with an added element of science fiction, I would say. Once again, this is another thing where the antagonistic dynamic between DC and Marvel can be seen quite nicely. Conan is a special case here. He resides in his own universe, although he recently has even become part of the Marvel universe as part of a team called the Savage Avengers. But his cold foes are pure magic, since in Robert E. Howard's original stories, technology really doesn't exist. Absolute cold, as the deadliest environments for human, will be the base for future battles of superheroes against their frozen fiends. Thank you for your kind attention on my icy journey from science to magic. Thank you.